Greetings, family. This is Pastor T with another installment of Connecting the Dots Unscripted. So we just had our primary in the state of Maryland last week. I am an unaffiliated voter, basically because I don't feel particularly drawn to either party per se. Each of them have some useful things to say, and then each of them have some fairly useless things to say. Be that as it may. So I go to vote, and since I'm an unaffiliated voter, I was not allowed to vote. I'll get into that more in a second. But they did have what they called nonpartisan races on the ballot. We have a process of affirming or rejecting people who've been appointed judges by the governor. And that is supposed to be a nonpartisan race. So they have the people who have been nominated by the governor and are usually currently serving as a judge appear on both the Democratic ballot and the Republican ballot. The problem with that is if you're an unaffiliated voter, then it's like, well, you don't get to vote. I'm sorry, but I thought these were unaffiliated positions, and I'm not unaffiliated. These were nonpartisan positions. How is it I don't get to vote? And I think the same occurs with school board, which is also allegedly nonpartisan. So in that way, unaffiliated voters essentially are deprived of their right to vote in those instances. And then by the general election, it's over. So one of the things I was then led to do was check and see, is this a problem that is, or phenomenon that's occurring nationwide or what? And here's what I found out. And I got this information at the National Conference of State Legislatures website. There are 9 states with closed primaries. And what a closed primary means is you can either vote as a Democrat or Republican. Then there are other parties that, Green Party or Libertarian or whomever, and I guess they would vote in their primary if there's anybody running. But essentially a closed primary, Democrat or Republican, we're going to force you into one of those corners or else you don't get to vote in the primary. Then they have a process called a partially, and there are 9 states in that category. Then they have the partially closed primary, and that there are 6 states in that system, and that allows parties to choose whether they allow unaffiliated voters or voters not registered with the party to participate in the nominating contest. So what that means is the political parties get to make that decision. Then there's partially open, and partially open is a system that permits voters to cross party lines, but they must either publicly declare their ballot choice or their ballot selection may be regarded as a form of registration with the corresponding party. Again, trying to force you into one party or another. Then the one that makes the most sense to me, open to unaffiliated voters. And that allows only unaffiliated voters, which means if you're a registered Democrat, you can only vote Democrat, registered Republican, only vote Republican, or any of the other parties. But if you are an unaffiliated voter, you are allowed to participate in any primary you choose, and you don't have to be registered for that party to do it. So if, as an unaffiliated voter, you make the decision or the determination that the person that most represents and best represents your interests and aligns with your political perspective or whatever is running in the Democratic primary, then you vote there. Republican primary, you vote there. So you get to vote for the best candidate. And then, of course, you are hoping that that candidate emerges from the primaries so that in the general election, when everybody gets to vote, you can cast your vote again to support the person you voted for in the primary. That makes the most sense, where political parties are not forcing you, compelling you to buy what they're selling, and you get to choose how you want to vote. Then after that, they have open primaries, and that's the one, and there are 15 states that have open primaries. So 9 have closed, 6 have partially closed, 6 have partially open, 9 have opened unaffiliated, and then 15 open primaries. An open primary, you can vote in either primary that you want. You just ask for whichever ballot you want, and then you do that. Now, the problem that some of the parties have with that is that the people can, from one party, can influence the other party's electoral outcomes. And I kind of get that. Because as we see happening in this particular election cycle, there are people who've been supporting folks that Donald Trump has said that he favors in races, because they figure that they will not perform well in the general election. So they're trying to put their thumb on the scale and affect the Republican primary, so they come out with a weaker candidate for the general election. So I kind of get why that might be a concern. On the flip side, if people were allowed to vote in whichever primary they choose, you might vote for the most reasonable candidate, the one that actually represents what you care about in an election. And then you would have them in a primary election, and then you would have them when the general election comes as well. Then they have another anomalous kind of primary called a top two system. And they have that in California and Washington, where however many people are running for the position, whoever are the top two vote getters then face off in the general election, which means that you could have two candidates from the same party who prevail in the primary election and then vote in the general election. You know, that's what they want to do in California or Washington, whatever floats your boat. But again, I don't know whether that allows for people who are unaffiliated to participate. And then they have a couple of other states that have sort of anomalous systems to their own states, Louisiana and Nebraska. But again, that gets us to the 50. Here's the thing. We should not be forced. We should not be forced or feel compelled to vote for one political party or the other. We should not be forced to be in, you have to be a Democrat if you want to vote, if you want to have a say in the primaries, which is in some states where races are determined. In Wyoming, if you don't win the Republican primary, you're probably not going to win. In Maryland, in most districts, if you don't win the Democratic primary, you're probably not going to win. So why should voters be deprived of making a choice, even if they're not crazy about a particular political party? But here's what I want to read from my book, Stop Falling for the Okie Doke, How the Lie of Race Continues to Undermine Our Country. And I want to read a couple of excerpts that some of the founding fathers of our country had to say about political parties. In a letter to Jonathan Jackson in 1780, John Adams, one of the founders of our nation and our second president, shared his concerns about a political system limited to two parties. And here's what he said. There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution. He wrote this in 1780. It's 2022. Truer words were never written. Yet another founder of our country, George Washington, shared his concerns in his farewell address in 1796, as he was preparing to leave the presidency after serving 2 terms as our first president. He said, quote, "In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts." Washington also said, "You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection." We ought to be united in our common citizenship, our common belonging to this union, irrespective of party, but because a party, that sense of commonality and common interest is chewed away at or destroyed, and it leaves us with what we have now. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. Anybody been paying attention the last few years, the last few election cycles, that we become more and more alienated from each other as a result of political party? And we think that the parties, there's an Indian proverb, two wings, same bird. In order for the United States of America to function, these two wings, the Republican and the Democrat, they've got to help to keep the ship of state, if you will, airborne. And as long as, I guess, they both play by accepted rules and norms, that works, no harm, no foul. I would disagree because, again, I think unaffiliated voters should not be forced to choose to be a Democrat or a Republican, that we should all have the opportunity to cast the vote for the candidate or candidates which best represent us and our interests, irrespective of whether we are affiliated with that party or not. I think that would give us better electoral outcomes. But what we see now is that people are so obsessed with their party that it's party first and not country first. And so what happens? You have gerrymandering out the wazoo, where states where Democrats control the legislature and they come up with crazy election districts, and Republicans the same. We had a congressional district here in Maryland, a largely and majority Democratic state. The congressional district was so jacked up, a judge rejected it and said that it looked like, quote, a broken-winged pterodactyl. Now you figure out what that even looks like, but that's a mess. And we should not cede the power or authority to either party to mess up the grand design. And, you know, there's some chinks in the armor, the Electoral College being one. I'll get to that another time. I've talked about it before, but I've had some new thoughts on that I want to share later. But for the most part, our republic, our constitutional republic, has worked well for 246 years. And it has been the envy of other countries as they emerge from frightful despotisms, like George Washington said, and emerge and want to have a more democratic and representative government. And we have it, and we're flushing it down the toilet because we want to insist that if you're not a Republican, you're the devil. If you're not a Democrat, you're the enemy. That's nonsense and foolishness. And so the two wings no longer function in balance. And anytime they have an opportunity to exert themselves over the other, what happens? Look around. And if we're not careful and we let these parties, which are not ensconced and captured for all time in the Constitution, but these parties, and it didn't start off this way. There was the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist Party. That's how it started. Then there was the Whig Party, WHIG. And then eventually, over the course of decades, it got down to the point where now there's a Democratic Party and a Republican Party. And those two parties will drag our country down to its destruction and its end, unless we, the people, assert and say, enough of this closed primary stuff. It's not about you, the political parties. It's about us, we the people, and we will determine who we want to vote for in either an open primary system or at least an open to unaffiliated system. And I promise you, if that became the standard all across the country, the number of unaffiliated voters would probably increase 2- or 3-fold to the point where there would be almost an equal balance between Democrats, Republicans, and independents / unaffiliated, as it is in reality, as opposed to what we're forced to understand, accept, and believe in the current configuration. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you for tuning in. I'll catch up with you next time in another edition, another installment of Connecting the Dots Unscripted. This is Pastor T, over and out.